Welcome to How I Made It in 3ds Max. I'm Lee Alailima-Rose, a designer, animator, and entrepreneur with over a decade of experience in countless projects ranging from small character animations to global retail design visualizations and everything in between. In this series, I'll walk you through how I use 3ds Max to create the animated 3D visualization of my Tome of Summoning D&D 5e monster cards, used in my crowdfunding videos and marketing. If you want to learn how to make these assets in detail, as well as a simple product turntable animation, you can check out my series on the 3ds Max Learning channel, where you can follow the step-by-step tutorials through modeling, texturing, animating, lighting, and rendering. Now, to show you kind of what we're aiming at, we can go to the Tome of Summoning Kickstarter, and we're going to make this small short sequence, which is just cards going up onto a Dungeon Master's screen from behind the screen, just to give a little, just to illustrate and visualize how this product works, or how you would use it in situ. We're lucky because we can see how this camera work and animation all came together, but before you decide to make any animation in 3ds Max, you should plan things out with a little bit of storyboarding. Now, for Tome of Summoning, we made ourselves a little storyboard. This is the entire storyboard of the entire Kickstarter video, but you can see here that I came up with the camera angle, roughly what we're going to be aiming for, and these two thumbnails will sort of serve as the key points, almost like the key frames of our camera and the animation that's on the camera. But the camera is going to move from this perspective up and over the Dungeon Master screen. So we'll dive into 3ds Max and we'll take a look at how we can make this. So this time we're in another scene of 3ds Max. This is a pre-built set that I had made for that particular Kickstarter video. Now, we've gone over how to make geometry and texture it and materialize it and get it ready for rendering. So coming up with the simple geometry for the set that we have here is pretty simple for even novice modelers. But as you can see, I've made little just rough forms of the dice that's used in Dungeons and Dragons. I've also made a form for a piece of geometry for the Dungeon Master screen that we're going to be animating around. And you can also see that I've created a simple piece of geometry to serve as the sort of set backdrop. Just a white, to create this white space, this white studio space for our animation to take place in. All of that is very simple to make with geometry, so we don't need to go into every step of how it's made. Now, in addition to the set, we've also imported a few cards, folded reference cards that we've made. Now, where do we get started? Well, first things first, organization is key to, especially when you start making more complicated scenes like this. Now we've got multiple assets that serve in different categories of purposes. So the first thing we do, I like to use the Layer Explorer to organize all of my scenes. So let's go to the Toggle Layer Explorer button. You're going to see that there's only one entry, which is the default, which is where normally everything gets made and imported, or it depends on what you're importing, but most geometry gets placed here upon creation. If you open it up, you can see that there's all sorts of everything in our scene is here. Now, if we go and press Ctrl-All, you'll see everything that gets selected. These are groups, these are layers that I had made previously when I imported these in, so we can ignore those. Once again, take a look at our scene. These are all of our assets that are going to be here. And let's start organizing things into different layers. So we're not going to have everything shoved into this default layer. Let's do a little bit of organization. Let's start by getting the camera. So just to see here, I've already made a camera, but all you need to do is go into Create, Camera, and make a physical camera. Now this camera is different in that we don't have a target for it. So all you have to do is when you make this new camera, you go into the Modify panel and you turn off Targeted. And now you will have a camera that just moves and stays facing in the direction that you leave it in, but you will have to rotate to point it in whatever direction you need it at. So now that we have that made, first let's put our camera into its own layer, just so we can turn it off if we need to, turn off the visibility on it so it doesn't clutter up our space. It's good to keep everything separated into proper categories of layers, just for your organization, especially when things start to get even more and more and more complicated. So grab your physical camera, go into the create new layer up here. Whatever's selected will get automatically placed into a brand new layer that you get to rename. I like to put numbers into my layers to kind of alphabetically or numerically organize them. And these sort of utility things like lights and cameras, I give them a category of 1. So I will say 1_CAM for camera. Now I've got that physical camera in this layer. And you can see I accidentally clicked the eyeball button to turn that visibility of the entire layer off. And you can see default also has that functionality. You turn that off and everything's turned off. So we have camera. Let's separate the set out. So to get a better handle of all of the assets that are in the space, I'm going to go into our top orthographic view. And I am going to go into the select mode. I'm going to draw a box around all of the cards that we have here. And right now I've got all the cards selected, but I also have the ground selected. I can hold Alt and deselect here. And just to be sure I know exactly what I'm selecting, I like to do the isolate selected key, which is also this button here. As you can see, it's bound to Alt Q, so you can either select this, and you can see this is exactly everything you need. All it does is just temporarily hides all the other things in the scene, except for the things that you have selected. So from here, I can just click Create New Layer, and I'm going to make another layer full of all these cards, and I'll give it a number 2, and I'm going to call this Cards. Now I can either select Isolate Selection or press Alt Q again to come back out of that. So let's hide those cards for now, and let's put the rest of the set all together. So I'm just going to select everything, deselect that camera because that's already in its own. Deselect the cards layer that's here. I don't know how that got selected, but we're going to have everything selected here, and we're going to add another layer. We're going to call this layer 2_set. All right. So just a little bit of tidying up, and now everything looks nice and neat. We're also going to make a new layer. So with nothing selected, we're going to make a layer for our lights, or the lights that we will be putting in here in the future. But it's good to think ahead and set these layers up. So create a new layer, 1_lit. Just my shorthand for lights. But you can call it whatever you'd like, as long as everything's organized. Now, let's start by taking a look at what our camera sees. So this is the shot that our camera is set up at, and it's going to be the first frame of our animated sequence. We're going to end the camera's animated sequence on the other side of the Dungeon Master screen to show where these cards are. But we want to kind of see what that looks like when the cards are there, so maybe we should animate the cards first and how they get there. Let's start by animating the cards first. We need to think about how long our animation is going to be, just get a rough idea. We can of course make adjustments and push and pull timelines and keyframes wherever we want, but let's just start by getting a rough idea. I would say I usually like around 3-second animation. It gets things done, but maybe we should go with 5. So a 5-second animation multiplied by 30 frames per second is going to be 150 frames. So why don't we set our timeline to reflect that? So let's go into time configuration. We're going to set the end time to 150. We're going to set our frame rate to the custom 30 frames per second, and that should be all we really need. So when we play this timeline, we can kind of imagine what the motion is going to be like, and that feels about right. So why don't we start there? So let's start by animating the cards first. As we said, when we wanted to time the camera to the motion that's present in the cards itself. Now we're going to grab the asset that the geometry that we want to animate, and we're going to turn on the toggle set key mode. And this is frame 0. This is going to be the first place that this card is going to be. We're going to set the key here. We don't want the animation to start immediately when the sequence starts. We want to give the viewers a little time to recognize what is in here before things start moving. So let's say we just give about a half second for the animation to start. So let's drop another key here. Now let's think about how this card is going to move in our animated sequence. All it's going to do is to rise up and land on our Dungeon Master's screen. Very simple movement. So we've started it on frame 15, and let's say 45 would be 1 second. Let's say a second. Give the card about, I'd say 1 second is about enough. We can push it if we feel like it's too fast. So from here, let's start moving the card. So we'll just move it up. I'm going to move it over. Going to zoom in and just land it so that the geometry is not going to intersect it. Great, so it's hanging, perfect. Let's move it, scoot it over to the side, and let's set the keyframe here. All right, so it's ended up here. How does it look? That is not what we want. As you can see, it's intersecting with the Dungeon Master screen, and we're going to need to find a way to stop it from doing this. And so what we can do is play it through. Do we at least like the timing of it? Yeah, I think the timing of it is good. So what we can do to give it a little more natural movement is when we imagine somebody picking it up, they would pick it up from the ground, raise it up probably a little bit higher than the Dungeon Master screen. Well, definitely a little bit higher than the Dungeon Master screen because it has to go over it. And then it moves forward over the Dungeon Master screen. So let's pick a little bit of time in between. Let's say the 30 frame line. And we're going to set another keyframe so that this card makes it up this high. We'll set that here. Let's see how that looks. Now that's looking better. Much better. Now there's still a little intersection going on over here, so why don't we put in another keyframe to have it over here, maybe push it forward a little bit, and set another key. And it's still doing a little bit of intersection, but we can do some finagling here. So why don't we see how the entire motion is timed for us? So we go bloop. Let's try it again. Feels a little too quick. Maybe we can select these keyframes and just push them forward a little bit by, let's say, 5 frames each. Slow it down, make it a little smoother. Okay, yeah, that's looking a little more natural now. Now it still is doing a little bit of intersecting here, so why don't we push this up a little higher over here so it does a little drop at the end. It's still intersecting. Now this is something that we're probably going to have to start going into our curves editor for, to edit this X movement, to get it to start moving in X so that it gets into position sooner, but we don't want it to, yeah, we're going to play around with this. Let's see. What we can also do to add a little bit of character to our animation is by giving it just a little turn. So it looks like you do a little hook. So if you can imagine how that animation would look like. So we're going to set this here, and we're going to key it on top of the keyframe that we had already made. That also fixes a little bit of what we have here, of the intersection that we're dealing with here. But it makes this nice little graceful turn at the end, as if it was being dropped there. Let's see how that looks. So now that we have a pretty good animation going on with our product here, let's animate the other cards here so that they go on top of the Dungeon Master screen. And we're going to offset their animation in time so that they don't all go up at once. They go in 1, 1, 1, so everything kind of looks synchronized. So let's do that now. Stop this. We'll go over here. Once this starts, we'll start with this one. All right, we have a pretty good animation going on here, showing the 3 cards going up onto the Dungeon Master screen. Turn my set key off and take a look at how this goes. It feels very stiff and robotic the way it hits the top here, so why don't we smooth that animation out just a little bit. Let's make sure that the geometry is not intersecting in bad ways. In fact, I may want to just increase the height, so let's turn the keys back on. Let's increase the height of these keys a little more, just up this far. Set that key there. We'll go to this keyframe here, push that up a little higher, set it there, and the same thing with this one. We'll go to this keyframe, push it just a little higher, set that key there. Great. So I'm thinking these go over pretty comfortably. Great. Let's open up our curve editor and let's take a look at, let's select our first one, and what we're really looking at is the Z translation. We want to kind of instead of it going go up, down, we're going to try to smooth it out a little more so it doesn't jar too much when it changes direction. So we'll go to Z position, search for where that jar happens, which is right here. You can see that curve is pretty sharp. Let's grab this handle for this tangent and let's extend it out so we sort of give it more space to move. Now that'll increase the speed when it leads up to it, and so we may need to move some keyframes back so it doesn't feel too fast, but this should sort of smooth out that change in direction. Now let's take a look at it, see how it goes. Yeah, so that's smoothed it out. Of course it rose up pretty fast, but it makes it feel a little snappier, I guess, so it doesn't take too long. And if we wanted to extend that time, we can just grab all of our keyframes and just move it by about 5 frames just to give it a little more breathing room. Now let's do the same thing here. First, let's start by extending this time by 5 frames, and the same thing is true here. I'll take these, extend it by 5 frames. Let's go into the curve editor. We'll do the same thing. Find our Z position, grab this tangent, smooth it out a little better. We can also straighten this out by the way it looks. We don't want to have too many ripples in our Z position movement, otherwise it'll look like it'll sort of stutter a little on its way down. Now, let's make sure this one also doesn't have that same Z position stutter. So it's nice and smooth. That looks about right. Great, and let's grab this one over here too, Z position. We'll snag this, push tangent out a little, give it a little more room to work. Smooth that change in direction down. This is looking a little rough, so we're going to just smooth it out. We don't want it to stretch too far. Smooth it out a little bit. Yeah, that looks better. Now, a tip with animation is not everything has to have a hard and fast value. One of the natural things about animation is just the hand of the animator. Is not everything is perfect. It kind of adds a sort of human aspect to your motion. If you make everything just by typing in numbers and squaring everything and replicating everything lines in the same angle, it gives it a stiff sort of look. But if you can sort of by hand move things around and key things there with a natural feeling to it, that adds a little more humanness to the animation. It gives it a little more natural feel. Not everything in the world is always aligned with each other, you know, so having that change in that very subtle shifts that may happen, those little subtle differences can make things feel a lot more real. So let's see how we look now. Yeah, I'd say that looks pretty natural, pretty well paced. Great, we'll go with that animation. So now that we have our geometry animated, let's animate the camera so that it can see all of this geometry happening, all these animations on our geometry happening. Start by selecting your camera. And we're going to be doing the same thing that we do with the geometry. We're going to set keys. Now, before we start animating, think about how your camera is going to work and how you're going to make it look at things. You could animate your camera with the target on. Now, this can make animating the camera a little easier, as you won't have to worry about the rotation of the camera so much, but you will have to worry about animating the position of the aim of the camera. So you'll be animating two things rather than one thing, which can complicate things. But I think for now, let's animate with the target on so that we don't have to fiddle too much around with the rotation of the camera. Sometimes with certain axes, if you turn in weird ways, it causes the camera to shift in strange ways, whereas with a target, it keeps things easier to aim with. So yeah, to turn your target on, just go into your camera's attributes and turn on the targeted box, and that will create the target for you wherever it is. Where did that target go? Luckily, target is created essentially where your live layer is. So open it up, let's grab that target, let's put it back into our camera layer, and let's make sure our camera layer is the active layer. So we have this target, we're going to let's align it to this card here. So center that, and there we go. So now that we have our camera and our camera aim target ready to go, let's start animating things. Now let's see where we should start with. Let's start by animating the aim of our camera. Now, as the first animation starts, let's start by moving the camera maybe around here. So let's turn the set key mode. We'll start by, we'll set that key there. Or maybe instead of 21, let's put it at 20. So there. As the middle one moves, maybe it would be a good time to move the camera to, let's say, around here. I'll say frame 50. Let's push this up to focus closer, maybe roughly around the center of the mass of moving objects here. So roughly around here, I'd say. We'll put that key there. And as they settle down, probably around frame 85, we'll put this a little closer here to the center. And we'll key that there. Now we can see this being animated and following the motion. Now let's select the camera and we'll do the same thing. It's useful to have the camera and the viewport of the camera visible at the same time so that you can see when to start moving. So what I also like to do is start the motion beforehand. I want to have a little bit of a camera move in right before the cards start to move. So why don't we do that? We'll start at frame 0. We're going to key it there. Just when the first cards start moving, let's key the camera. And in fact, I want the camera to move in the direction towards the target. So these axes do not reflect where I want this camera to move. So we're going to go into, instead of view, we're going to set our translation, our reference coordinate system as it's called in the tooltip. We're going to set this to local. Now local will change the axes so that Z represents the direction that the object is sort of facing in. So everything is sort of relevant to the angle of the actual object itself. So I'm going to take the Z-axis and I'm going to push it in towards the target. I'm going to key that there. So now we can look inside of the camera. We can see a little bit of, let's make this frame active by clicking in it. And we can see the camera just pushes in a little bit. In fact, it might be a little too much. I might have overdone it. So we're going to pull it out just a little further. There we go. So there's a very subtle move in. And then once things start to move, we'll slowly move the camera up, say roughly maybe around 55. We'll zoom the camera a little further forward. We're going to lift it up. And let's see. I'm going to go into our top viewport and I'm going to grab the center part and I'm going to swing it around by this. Push it in a little further. Let's see. Now we'll key that there. Let's see how that camera move looks. It's not looking too bad. I think it's a little too close. So why don't we pull that camera further out a little bit. Oh, I forgot to key. So let's pull that camera out a little bit. We'll key that there. And as it comes over, we'll slow it down a little bit and we'll turn it through here. Let's lower it a little as it's made its way over the Dungeon Master screen and push it in just a little more. We'll key that there. See how that looks. Let's maximize this so we get a better look at how we're doing. Now this camera's doing a strange little wiggle here, which is not what we want. Let's take a look at it. Something about this x-axis is wiggling the camera a little bit. And that's something that happens when we're animating and setting keys with tangents already set in. And if you remember our tangents, we go into our curve editor and let's grab this X position. See where that key is. Now what's causing this? Let's start by turning this into a linear. That kind of turns the camera movement into something a little more rapid than we want. Let's open this back up. We'll just set this back to an automatic tangent and that'll smooth it out. But we don't want that little wiggle to happen. We want this motion to go directly here. So why don't we straighten this out, pull that tangent this way. We'll point this tangent to that one. Now let's see if we got rid of that wiggle. No, it's still there. So let's open this back up. We're going to set this to linear so that it points directly there. We're going to set this one, I'm just going to keep it pointed to its first one and it'll smooth that way out this way. Maybe we need to smooth, give a little more weight to that. Could be the y-axis as well, because the aim is not moving. Let's take a look at our other ones. So this one, let's also set this to linear, so it points there, and let's give a little more breathing room for that one. And the same thing is true with Z. We'll also just have Z pointed, and we're gonna give a little more of a gradual direction change. That may have solved what we need to solve. So, yeah. So this is feeling a little too quick. I think we need to slow this entire thing down. So why don't we do the same thing that we did with these cards, and we're going to just push even further, let's say 10 frames. We'll take this, move it 10 frames, take this, move it 10 frames, and we'll even adjust the point of the camera by 10 frames. Let's see how that changes everything. Also change the camera. Push this camera by 10 frames. Spend a little more time going over, and actually move this by 10 frames too. Spend a little more time zooming in before moving around, because it's this motion that is really fast too. So let's push this even further, another 10 frames away. We'll see how that feels. In fact, we can take the aim and let the aim start moving a little later, by like 10 frames, let's say. See if that feels a little more natural. So the cards begin to lift, we move the camera around, and we come and settle over here. Let's finish the camera's animation and see how the entire thing looks. So from here, the camera isn't just going to linger there, it's going to keep moving and rotate around. So let's say at 125, we'll have it over here. And then at 150, oops. And at 150, we'll have it settle out over here. Alright, that's starting to feel natural. We're going to have to rotate our background so that we cover this back set. So why don't we do that? We'll turn off keys and let's rotate the background. We'll rotate that a little further. So the entire thing is always on a white backdrop. maybe the camera movement all the way around is a little too much. So we will take this. We're just going to get rid of that last keyframe. All we do is highlight the key and press delete. That'll delete that last keyframe. And we'll just stretch this keyframe all the way out here, so it gives a nice gradual rotation around, very slow, so we can see as it goes up. Now if we have a little more time over here, let's push this about 10 frames this way and make this maybe 5 frames so we can slow down. In fact, maybe we don't even need this last one. This camera movement is a little fast, so I want to even get rid of that keyframe. And maybe we should just spend more time here. Just put this all the way out there. We'll put this one all the way over here. Sometimes a simpler animation is better. Now it feels like this movement right here is the fastest. Let's slow it. Let's make that even further away. Slow it down a little. Yeah, that's feeling much better. A little more natural. It whips around a little bit, but we can always fix that in here. Let's take a look at some of the curves here. When you see this little wiggling happen, that's usually not a good sign that there's a wobble happening here. So why don't we just smooth that out? Same thing with the Y position here. That's not looking too bad. Let's push these a little further this way so that the change in direction is not so stark. Yeah, why don't we try that? Hopefully that feels a little more natural. All right, I think we have some animation to go off of. So now that the animation is set, why don't we set up some lights? So let's go to our light layer and we'll activate the light here. So when we create a new light, it will be in that layer. Let's go into our perspective. Make an Arnold light. And we'll point it this way. It's a little difficult to see on this white backdrop, but set that. Let's also turn the local back to view so we can move it around in the 3D space, the scene space itself. So we'll start with some light there. We can just duplicate this light and make a second light over here. Have a little 2 light situation going on. And let's see how this looks. Go in, we'll set up our render settings. Single, Arnold. Everything seems pretty set up. Why don't we take a look at what the render says? So the render is definitely too bright. Let's start turning down some lights. So we'll minimize that. Go into our perspective view. And let's turn down some of these lights. We'll set the exposure down to 4. We'll set this intensity down to about 0.5. So we'll set this one down to 0.5 as well. And make this one 4 as well. Now let's open back our render view back up and let's use the IPR. So why don't we start with that? Oh, I'm looking at the wrong camera, buddy. Physical camera. Okay, looking better now. Now what could also be useful is setting your environment to a white environment. If you imagine how we've been rendering with these black backgrounds. But if you set it to a white background, that can bounce some light into your scene and brighten everything up. It may not need to be perfectly white, but you could add a little bit of light that way. So press 8 to open up your environments and effects. You can set a background color. Let's brighten it up a little bit, and as you can see in the IPR, it really does brighten things. And why don't we keep that for now? And with the IPR, we can move the animation along, so we can see how everything looks, how the lighting and our renders look for every frame here. Why don't we move the camera? See how this looks. This is looking pretty good. Though the Dungeon Master screen is getting a little lost in that bend. So I think perhaps we should take this light and let's make this light light the other side of the Dungeon Master screen. And this light, we'll bring a little closer and maybe push it to where that light was. We're just fiddling with the lights a little bit. Let's come back down now that we've changed that beginning light setup. And yeah, this lighting's not looking too bad. Let's see how it looks when we move up. We can see things pretty well. As the camera turns around, how are we looking here? Alright, how about when we come around the backside? That light on the opposite side may be too close to the Dungeon Master screen, so why don't we turn it around? Let's see how that is pointed upwards as well, so that it's aiming at the actual lights. Okay, looking pretty good. How's that final shot? Let's get this lighting to even out a little bit more over here. Let's come back to the first ones, and I think this lighting will work for our purposes. Perhaps maybe we get the target of this light, which we can select from the layer. Get the target of this light and let's push it up a little bit, probably about that high. And I think we have enough lights and animation and camera work to get our render started. So why don't we stop the IPR? We'll close down the Arnold render view. Let's open up our render setup, and let's pick the active time segment from 0 to 150. We're going to set our output size 1280 to 720. We're going to pick our render output, which should go over to our project render output. So by selecting files, it'll take us to our 3D project render output. Let's make another folder and call this one the card DM screen animation footage. We'll select that, save the file as card dm screen anim. Save that file type as a, let's do it as a JPEG, a series of JPEGs. And from there, we're set up. As soon as we click the render button, we'll start one frame at a time. So why don't we get started with that? So now that our renders have completed, we can take a look at our footage. Now we have a sequence of every single render that we've made, and we can string them all together and create our video. And that video should end up looking like what we made here. Now that's how you render out products for visualization in 3ds Max, which was crucial for Tome of Summoning and our Kickstarter project. And with that, thank you for watching.